I got to make the speeches, so I have to decide what I'm going to talk about. So I think that one of the things that is a legitimate point of beginning for farbrengen of Chof Av is now, there are not many stories known, and not all the stories that are known are necessarily reliable. I've been on about it my whole life, thank God, and I've heard many stories. Some of the stories I don't even remember where I heard them. And people ask me all the time, "Where did you take the story?" And quite often I'm able to find them a source, and then sometimes you find that I didn't quote it precisely. But there are many stories that I just don't remember. I heard it as a child. It was a bucket. And I don't remember my sources, but there are a few stories that are known about the Rebbe and his Chof Av. And this is what I'm going to start with. This is the beginning of our farbrengen for Chof Av. We call it the Rebbe's Chof Av. So I'll tell you a few stories. One of them is, I heard this as a bucket. Again, I don't know how reliable these stories are. I'm not going to keep apologizing. It was one apology for the whole night, yeah? I'll tell you ahead that there was a period of time that the Rebbe had a meeting to bring his parents the mail. There was a bucket, one man. So every day he would wait for the mailman, however he did it, and he would bring his parents the mail. And the Rebbe's parents understood that the Rebbe is bringing them the mail was Chof Av. That's how they understood it. Okay, so then the Rebbe got sick. For those who do not know, the Rebbe's hasmod, the Rebbe's diligence as a bichlal, but as a young person was so intense that the Rebbe's Amchana, the Rebbe's mother, used to tell people that she has to fight with her boys they should eat. As long as they have no pesach. She ripped the boy from a sefer to eat something. So that was an incredible master. He didn't have time for anything. There are a few well-known occasions where the Rebbe closed the sefer and got involved in Yom HaSkalos because there was a very acute need. So the Rebbe stopped his sefer and did what needed to be done. One of those was when there was an epidemic of typhus. It was about 100 years ago. And people were sick. And there was a quarantine. Not that we have a quarantine, if you live in your house. They put you into a...
Back to the Rebbe, the person who wrote it has to finish it. And the Rebbe said, it's kind of a little impossible because the person who wrote it passed away already. And the Rebbe told him, that was my brother. And he said to the Rebbe, your brother? The Rebbe said, yes. Then the Rebbe said, he passed away 10 years ago.
More than 10
years ago. So he said 10 years ago, and the Rebbe said approximately. Yud Gimel Yeh touching Yud Beis until Yud Shvat touching Lamed Hey, more than 10 years. But maybe what you could say is Vav Tishrei touching Chof Hey was approximately 10 years before Yud Shvat touching Lamed Hey. And when I heard that, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Until then, I thought that the Rebbe was fooling his mother. Api Din, Api Tein, Api Allah, the Rebbe was allowed to. When the Rebbe is a Isha Emes. The Rebbe doesn't know how to fool anyone. He just doesn't know how to do it. As long as the Rebbe's mother was alive, the Rebbe's brother was alive. Maybe you could say, like, how? I don't know. But maybe you could say, like it says, Pashas Vayigash, the Yehuda said,
Hi.
If a person drinks alone, he's a drunk. If somebody drinks with him, then he's a chassid. Or a community drunk. Drunk b'chavrisid. L'chaim l'bracha. It's well known that the Rebbe Rashab said, it's well known that the Rebbe Rashab said, when Mashiach comes, he will take 3 chassidim by the hand, 3 people. He'll introduce them to Mashiach, right in the figure, introduce them to Mashiach, and he will say, look what I reared, look what I raised. So the way the story is told, the first one is that Mendel Chaim. The Mendel Chaim was the Nezhin and not Nezhin. I was in Nezhin. He has a tzir, he has a grave. He was murdered of Kiddush Hashem. He was killed in the Kreuz of Ein Tes. He passed away. He was 39 years old. It was before the Rebbe Hashem passed away. The mental chem was a gon added nigret. A mishugan a gon. And he was a real chassid. He was a chem. After Schneerson is chem. I'm not a chem, so I can say it. It's true. Mishpachas, half Lubavitch is chem. Or more than half Lubavitch is chem. He was the son of the Radat. He was a very big chassid. He was a very big gon. And he was the Rebbe Hashem's mouth. When they would have Sibas HaRabbonim, when there were the big meetings of the Rabbonim, even if the Rebbe was sitting there, the Rebbe didn't talk. Mendel Chaim would speak with a young man. He passed away at 39. He was a Goan Oilam, Mendel Chaim. The second was the Zalman Schneerson from Lodz. The Zalman Lodz, as they called it. I don't know very much about him. He passed away right before the Holocaust, and he was an old man, an elderly. Rabbi Greenglass from Montreal was a makabel of his. Rabbi Greenglass from Montreal, his chassidus came from the Zalman Lodz, the Zalman Schneerson. We had now, we lost, one of the many people we lost in the last few months was the Rav, was Rabbi Shrei. And Rabbi Shrei tells a story, and I'm repeating the story very, very poorly. But I'm relying on it. There's a tape. You can hear Rabbi Shrei telling the story that when they were in Pucky after the war, so all the Lubavitchers were in one row, the barracks. Pucky was the displaced people's camp. That's what it was. It was essentially I don't know, an army, whatever it was during the war. It was the barracks, and there were rows and rows of these large rooms. And every community got a number of barracks. All the Lubavitchers lived together, or the Pelishah lived together, and so on. And so the Anash all lived together in Pucky, and there was one farbrengen, and two Yidden came in. They were not frum. Two Yidden came in, and there was a Chassidish farbrengen, a Lubavitcher farbrengen, a Chassidish farbrengen, so they joined. And they came from Lodz, and they knew the Zalman Lodz, and the Zalman Schneerson. Rabbi Shrei tells the story, and Rabbi Shrei sings the niggin. He actually sings the niggin. So the two of them got up, and they began to sing a tnuah that the Zalman Lodz was singing. And they were not frum. They had gone through Shidduch and Dura Gehenna. They went through the war, and at that point in their lives they were not frum. And they began to sing how their mashpia, how the Zalman Lodz would sing. And Rabbi Shrei describes the emotion. Two boys who had been Chassidish Adochim, who had gone through who knows what, and they were broken in body and in spirit, went back in their memory to the best of the time of their lives were. They were repeating a niggin from their Rebbe, from their Mashpia, and they were crying uncontrollably. Rabbi Shrei describes it. For those who don't know, they gave out a sefer for Rabbi Shrei. I don't know if it's an actual book or it's a PDF, but I have the book and I read much of it. There's like 100 pages of stories. This is one of the stories of the Zalman Schneerson of Lodz. He was a chazir, he was in the middle of Epic. His yichas, I don't know the diuk, but he was a very big makubal. So the Mendel Chaim was a big Nigla. And the Zalman Lodz was a big makubal. And the third was the Rebbe's father, Levi. Or if they called him a Lubavitch, Levi. And because the Rebbe's father was great in Nigla and Nistan. And there's a story about Levi also. There's a story about Levi also. What's the story about Doma? I'm sorry I'm digressing, but if I was sorry I wouldn't digress. So I'm digressing on purpose. I'm just pointing it out. That the Rebbe said once in the Farbrengen, I remember it. I think I remember it. When I was growing up, I couldn't understand. Daily Chassidim, great Chassidim, who were Evdei Elikim and Gewaldig Talmidei Chachamim, and Chassidim called them by their name. And the Rebbe gave a dogma from the Radat, Hirschel thereof, Hirschel Chenigeve. Hirschel Chenigeve, the Radat, was in Madregas Tzadik, not Madregas Betin. It's Madregas Tzadik. It's brought from Sform that the Rebbe Marashta gesagt, es ist Zeit zu trachten wegen Avedas HaTzadik. The Radat was in Madregas Tzadik. And Chassidim called him Hirschel. They didn't call him Hirschel thereof. So the Rebbe said, how could you call a person of such a stature by a nickname, not even his proper name, Rebbe Hirschel. So the Rebbe said, the Rebbe answered the question, a little different than the word I'm going to tell you. The Rebbe answered the question by saying that it says in the Torah that every chassid sees his Rebbe all the time, and you're not allowed to give cover to a Talmud in the presence of the Rav. So since by Hasidim the Rebbe's countenance was always present, so other people as great as they may have been next to the Rebbe, were Hirschel. That's what the Rebbe said in the farbrengen. But the story that I want to share, when you get to the Rebbe's father, the Levik, is this. It's printed in a sefer which is called Zichron Noisai. It's a biography of a chassid whose name was Kabnacham Shmayo Sasonkin. Shmel Derov. He lived in Yerushalayim. Du gedenkst him? And ich bin am Hus, ich bin Atzir. Ha? And he went there a shady. He was a very big lion. He was a big Talmud Chacham. Big Talmud Chacham. He was a big chassid. And he came to Yerushalayim after the war, and he did big things. In a lot of ways, he wasn't stuck. In a lot of the other Chassidim came to throw like they were just retired. He was youthful. He wrote books. He was a brilliant writer. He wrote beautifully. So he tells a story. Shmuel Batume tells a story that he was a bocher. He was a bocher. It must have been the 1910s or even the 1900s. And the seder was that the bocher was the fundraiser. The bocher was sent out of the bocher was sent by this. All the yeshivas in Russia did this. They would send bochers from place to place to raise money for the yeshiva. And of course, they were the perfect advertisement. If you wanted to raise money for yeshiva, the people who you were soliciting the funds from got to look at a book and you say, simple. What type of cleaning produced? So he was sent to raise money in a Kedinflav. They never paid us. So the address, the Kedinflav was the Rebbe's father, the Lubavitch Chassidim, Schneerson. The Levik used to come to Lubavitch all the time. The Rebbe's father was Lubavitch a lot. He didn't bring his sons ever, which is a story. But the Levik was Lubavitch all the time. So they all knew him. So the Shmuel details and tells the story that he came to the house of the Rebbe's parents and he knocked on the door and the Rebbe's Chana opens the door. He was a boy at 17, 18. Like, how old could he have been? And he says to the Rebbe's mother, Levik is here. And she looked at him like she was prepared to ring him up. Excuse me, Levik? My husband is Levik? Levik? She didn't say anything. But he saw that he planted a bad seed. And it never rotted. She never forgave him. Whenever she would see him, decades later, he saw that she's still upset with him because she called her husband Levik. And it bothered him. So 40 years later, she had a minute, the Rebbe's mother had a minute, that every year, she used to make a farbrengen at home. She would invite a few Chassidim, and they would say L'chaim, and they would say L'teira, and she would talk about her husband. She would talk about her husband. So Shmuel Batume got himself invited to one of these farbrengens. He made arrangements he should be invited. Anyway, he came into the house and she looked at him with the same cross eyes. She still remembered that she called the Rebbe's father Levik. And he sat down by the farbrengen, and at a certain point, so everyone took turns, so she asked permission to say something. So she said, yeah. So he said that it says in the Gemara, that Kol Rav Nibot, that if you lived in Chutz La'aretz, and had smicha, whatever kind of smicha it was in Chutz La'aretz, you were called the Rav. Kol Rebbe in Eretz Yisrael. If you lived in Eretz Yisrael, you were called Rebbe with a Yud. Then you had the Sanhedrin, where it was Bezdin, and also they were called Rabbon, like Rabbon Gamliel, Rabbon Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbon. And then the Gemara says, Godol mi Rabbon Shmoy. The greatest Kanoim was not Rav, not Rebbe, not Rabbon, it's Hillel, it's Shammai, it's Abaye, it's Rabban. So he quoted this Gemara, and he said that this explains why by Chassidim, even the greatest of Chassidim, they didn't say Harav, Reish Kopenei, Hagoylo, Hagon, Hatzadik, Hachosim. They just simply said their name. He says, for example, Levik. For example, Levik. And he saw her forgive him. 40 years of a grudge. He watched her say, okay, I get it. Good. He writes the story in his own biography, his own statement. Anyway, getting back to the other slide. Levik, Reb Levik, Rav Levik. He was a Goan in Nigel, was going in Kabbalah. Moshe could go in Nigel, really going in Kabbalah. And of course, his phonetic Kabbalah is staggering. The Rebbe's Chana describes this, the Rebbe's mother describes this, and in the documents, in the summer of 1991, the Tafshin Nun Aleph, the KGB was doing tshuva. Tchia Sameh said they couldn't figure out them, and all the people that they killed, to bring them back from the dead, there wouldn't be enough carbon in the world to account for all the people so they would give out the files of the people that they abused to their relatives. So a lot of Lubavitchers got files from parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, enough carbon in the world to account for all the people so they would give out the files of the people that they abused to their relatives. So a lot of Lubavitchers got files from parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who had been killed by the Stalin. It was an appeasement. It was you can't fix, but there was a tshuva. They were trying to do the right thing. And the Rebbe got his father's folder, his father's journal. And I read it. They printed it in Farbrengen magazine. I can't imagine the Rebbe got too much nachar. It was the summer of 1991. It was very painful to read. Certain parts of it are quite painful. One of the things that they reference is that the Rebbe's father had bookcases, not bookshelves, bookcases, whole bookcases of notebooks with handwritten literature. The Rebbe's father was an incredibly prolific writer. Most of the writing that he did is, look, we don't have it. And they wrote in the file that they burnt it. The Rebbe said, I remember thinking at the time, that the Rebbe saw the file, and it said in the file that they burnt it, and the Rebbe said, we'll still find it. The Rebbe knows best. And this is not only Das Elyon, this is not only Ruchnius, it's Das Ha. A man told me that the Russians never burnt anything. They said they burnt, but everything is stacked and filed and labeled and whatever the word is, categorized, and it's someplace. The Rebbe said, the Rebbe's father was an incredibly prolific writer. And from the little that we have, the best example of the Rebbe's father's style of writing is the letters that he wrote to the Rebbe. Because the letters that he wrote to the Rebbe, he wrote when he was in a normal life. His commentaries on the Zohar, his commentaries on the Mishnah, the different Rishimis that he tell you, he wrote on the margin. He had no paper. He wrote on the margins of his Sfarim. How big is the margin? And I don't know if you've ever seen it. You see these colors. The Rebbe kind of prepared ink from different. You see pink earth. You see fluorescent pink and a bright orange. There's really beautiful colors if you're a teenage girl, not if you're the Rebbe's father. But you can see on one page 4 or 5 different colors. It's very interesting. They showed it in the library. If you go into the Rebbe's library, they show it. You can see the original, how it looked. And I heard from people that when the Rebbe's mother was carrying these yeshivas, she had one concern, that the ink shouldn't fade before it got to her son. Her only concern was, she had no idea how good at ink she was. She was learning on the job. She made ink. She made ink. She said, how long is the ink going to last? Well, the ink is still there now. It's 80 years afterwards. But she was very concerned that the ink would fade. Anyway, so he was an incredible... So where do you see the fanem of Rav Levi, the breadth of his style in the letters that he writes to the Rebbe? Because that's written on paper. He had plus paper. Yeah. A letter, 20 pages, 30 pages, 40 pages. And you don't understand the word. The whole thing is cold. I told somebody, there's a volume of letters from the Rebbe's father to the Rebbe. It's 300 pages. You could read the entire book in 15 minutes. I did it. I read the whole book in 15 minutes. How do you read a 200-page book in 15 minutes? I'll explain it. You'll understand right away. I'll give you an example. The Rebbe's father is writing a letter to the Rebbe and to the Rebbe. Oftentimes they're addressed to the two of them, and they're connected to special occasions. You just kiss it, Judal Kislev is always a letter for the Yemachassan, and there's special occasions. The Rebbe's father wrote them letters. And the letter begins very ordinary to my son and to my daughter-in-law. Gives them brachas, and you see, very painful in the early 1930s, every letter he's giving them a bracha. For Zanachayim Chayom. And then he stops. You see, he just doesn't do it anymore. You see that he's, and the Friedrich Rebbe comes in the Zelben Tag. And the Oliver de Beiglis, the erste Poyor nach der Chassan, wünschen sie, and then they don't write it so much. So it's 4 lines, 5 lines. How many lines do you write this? How you doing? And then the letter that stands out of my mind is, the Rebbe sent his father a pair of shoes. So after the 3 lines of brachas, it had all of the shoes, parentheses. Then you have 20 pages on the Kabbalah of shoes. And it goes, at the end of the 20 pages, at the end of the parentheses, Haim Toiv, period. And he signs his name. It's so cute to see. He writes a letter. The letter's 6 lines. But he makes a reference to something and he goes off on a tangent. So he puts it in the middle of the sentence of parenthesis. The parenthesis is like a whole book. Then there's the end of the parenthesis and the finish of the sentence. And all the name table. In between Hanola and name table is 15 pages. You see the breadth, the Bekias Nefesh, how much he knew. But the Koyach HaChidish, that Leivik was always, he was mamish, every time he opened his mouth, new material came out. And I say new, I don't mean new that he thought of it today. No one ever said it. And it's so much. We don't understand it. We don't understand it. It's beyond our understanding. To learn one of those letters is an exercise of weeks or months. But you don't understand. There's a lot of gematrias, but it's not only gematrias. It's Kabbalah, it's Higoyim, there's a lot of Nigla, there's a lot of Midrashim. It's written so concisely. You see the breadth of this person, how much was in his brain, and how well organized it was, and how he builds gigantic palaces, and he builds them down to the plumbing. He doesn't miss a tile. It's so gargantuan, so big. So there's a story that goes with this. And the story that goes with this is that the Leivik was on Kabbalah. The Leivik can say Kabbalah. I was just thinking, you would say Kabbalah. So I'll tell you two stories, yeah? And we're talking about this point. The first story requires a shtickle abdomen. The story is that the Rebbe Rashab wanted very, very much that the Rebbe's father should be the Rav of Yekatinoslavl. It was called turbulent. The Rebbe Rashab wanted very much that the Rebbe's father should be Rav in Yekatinoslavl. Yekatinoslavl was a community of Jews that then, at the turn of the last century, was probably 150 years old, or even less, maybe 100 years old. The Jews living in this city. The founder of the Jewish community, Yekatinoslavl, was a rich man who knew how difficult lives of the Jewish people were in the Shtetl, in the villages. So he had permission to live in the big city. He had a special permit. So he created phony businesses. He created fake businesses. A storefront, and behind the storefront is nothing. And he came to the government and he said he needs to hire employees that he trusts. He has to hire workers that he can trust. So they gave him permission to import Jews. He brought 400 mishpachas. Then, in times of Hitler, 400 mishpachas to live in Yekatinoslavl. Klaimesh, they're all working for him. There was no work. But if you live in a big city, there was opportunity. By the time the Rebbe's father became Rav, those 400 communities, 400 families, was tens of thousands of Jews. It was a very big, dynamic, diverse, politically intense place. Powerful. It was not a fun Rabbanos. The boss, since the Miyasa of this Kehillah of Yidmon the Lubavitcher, he had come to the Mittel Rebbe for a Rav. And from that point on, whenever the Rav would pass away, whoever it was would come to the Rebbe, whichever Rebbe it was, the Mittel Rebbe, and they would send him a new Rav. The Rav before that Leivik was called the Rebbe Revov. The Rebbe Revov Kozernikov was his family name. They called him Berevov Katinoslavl. I read him a whole lot. He talked about him as if he knew him. He passed away in 1909. And that's when the Rebbe became Rebbe. The Rebbe took his position. He was a chassid from Tzemach Tzedek. If I'll have time, I'll go back and tell you stories about Berevov. The part was like, by the time that Berevov passed away, the community was very divided. It was no longer a unified community. First of all, you had Pashat Frum, one on the side, not Frum. For most of the history of Russia, most of the Yidden were Frum. The idea that they were not Frum Jews was a Chiddush. And there were a lot of Yidden who Nebuch, that they see the Shaynas of Meshukas and not Frum anymore. And they didn't want the Frum Rav. They certainly didn't want a Rav as Frum as a Leivik, because a Rav in Russia had official sanction of the state. There was no separation of church and state. He was an officer of the government with a lot of power in a lot of ways, including taxes. The community, the Jewish community, like you have today in Europe, they used to raise money, and the Rav oversaw those, they tax people. And the Rav oversaw those resources, and he put them where he wanted. So if the Rav is at your team, you can get the money to go where you want it to go. If the Rav is on the other team, you can go where you want it. So there was a huge fight over succession. Who would be the Rav? And the Rav Shabbos makes a nefesh that the real Rav Shirah. He wanted a lady. So the people came up with 101 reasons why the lady was the father. He's too froh, one of the excuses that came up with, which frankly is quite a legitimate excuse, was that all Reb Levi's smichas were from Chassidish Rabban. A Chassidish Rabban, the smichas from Chassidish Rav is like me. I'm a Chassidish Yigamah with a smichas from Chassidish Rav. It's a rachmanas on the institution of smichas, my smichas. I have it sitting in one of my volumes in the Shulchan Aruch. I don't even know which. I would never hang it on my wall. It's embarrassment to my wall. It would be a waste of afraid. My smicha, ich hab smicha. Chavarez genommen smicha. I don't know yet. When a Chassidish Bacher gets smicha from his own Rosh Hashiva, it's not a big deal. You say, you want it? Rabbi Yossi Paltiel, he went to get smicha from the Meisha Feinstein. The Meisha Feinstein gave smicha to all his Talmidim. When Rabbi Yossi Paltiel, they kept him 3 days. They tortured him. Your own Talmidim, it's not the same. So the title was that all the Levi's smichas are Chassidish smichas. So there's no right that I can let it out feel Chassidish Rav, Chassidish smichas. So the Rebbe's father had to go get smichas from the Snagdish Rabban. It was a precondition to the Rabbanos. And of course, when that was how they found another excuse was a whole pash. So one of the smichas that the Rebbe's father got was from Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim Briski. Reb Chaim Soloveitch. It's really hard to describe what kind of a muhus Reb Chaim was. I once told him a snagid, and I said it sincerely, I wasn't being sarcastic. Go get smichas from the Snagdish Rabban. It was a precondition to the Rabbanos. And of course, when that was how they found another excuse was a whole pash. So one of the smichas that the Rebbe's father got was from Reb Chaim. Reb Chaim Briski. Reb Chaim Soloveitch. It's really hard to describe what kind of a muhus Reb Chaim was. I once told him a snagid, and I said it sincerely, I wasn't being sarcastic. I said, Reb Chaim was such a Chassidish Yid. He's what he talked about, he was a Litvar. Reb Chaim was an incredible Chassidish Yid. Reb Chaim was a bittul diker Yid. Reb Chaim was so not in the tip of a Snagdish Gadol. He wore a smashed hat. He walked bent over on the side of the street. He took up no space. What they say about Reb Chaim? In Reb Chaim's private home, people used to hang advertisements. You know how you go on the street, you want to sell a piece of furniture. So you put the piece of furniture, and the bottom you put phone numbers. And people rip off the strip. Reb Chaim had Maidois in his living room.
His wife was
Yeah. His wife said, we never sleep in our own bedroom. But his house was a hektish. That was the kind of a man he was. He was a gon oil. And he was such a Chassidish Yid. He was bemis a Chassidish Yid. A richtig Chassidish Yid. But the Chaim was a gadol. Was bemis a gadol. Rebbe and Shab and him were so close. They were such good friends. They were really, really friends. Very close. And there was a lot of mutual respect. The Chaim was older than Rebbe and Shab by a few years. So there's a letter which was now found. They printed in the last 5 years a new volume of the Rebbe Rashab Iglis Kedesh, Chelik Vov, which just came out in the last few years. They found letters in Russia. Maybe half the letters in that volume, or a third of the letters in that volume, are Terev Levik. Somebody found these letters, brought them here, and they published them. In one of the letters that Rebbe Rashab was writing to the Rebbe's father about his smicha, and that he needs to go to Reb Chaim, to go to Brisk, to get smicha from Reb Chaim. He went to several Snagdish Rabbanim, and amongst the Rabbanim was Reb Chaim. So the Rebbe Rashab writes to Leivik, I need to ask Reb Chaim to help you, but I can't just write him out of the blue. It's like the kind of relationship they had. He said, I need another reason to write. And if I write it because of something else, I'll ultimately include the request for the smicha. So the Rebbe Rashab is sort of saying to the Leivik, I can't ask him. As much as I want to ask him to give you the smicha, that's the kind of respect they have to him. I can't just ask him to give smicha to mind that I tell him. He says, but go to Brisk, he'll give you the smicha. Mepnei shehu yirei shamayim ve'eretz. It says it's printed in this case. The Rebbe Rashab writes about Reb Chaim. He'll go to Brisk, he'll give you the smicha. He's really God-fearing. So there's of course this story. There's two stories which the Rebbe told about farbrengen. There's the story with the sukkah, and then the other story is Reb Chaim verheld Reb Leivik for 3 days. He absolutely tortured him. 3 days. 3 days. What was the Fateh? Reb Chaim was a Rav. He was Rosh Hashiva also, but he was a Rav. So he sat in the bed in Shtivel. People came in with shilas. Anybody who came in with a shilas, Reb Levi had to paskin. And after Reb Levi paskin, then he had to defend it. He had to give his nimuk. And Reb Chaim was a tough. Rabbi Metzger, Gesundheit, described getting smicha from Reb Chaim's grandson, from Rabbi Yossi Paltiel. He would bring the bochum into a room, and he would mop the floor with them. In Wayu, he would scream at them. He would scream briski gishrei, like Amaratzi, Vedden. He would torture them, and then when the fair was over, he would suddenly smile and say, "Now you're not bothered." After they failed the test, he told them. Anyway, so the Reb Chaim tortured Rebbe's father, and the Rebbe's father, Yochel Kamoini, and you can't. So at one point, Reb Chaim was so impressed by the Rebbe's father. The Rebbe told this story about Farbrengen. There's actually a tape. I never heard the tape, but there's a tape of it. Leivik, as I got the cup, cook for the lake, says he. He says, Leivik, such a good head, look what you're wasting it on. Wasting it on Kabbalah. Leivik, as I got the cup. This is what he said. Leivik, as I got the cup, cook for the lakes. This is the first story. This is the first story about the Rebbe's father's involvement in Kabbalah. The second story is that the Rebbe's father used to say Kabbalah. It was like a fountain. A mayan amizgaben. And he wasn't repeating the same schede. He was aulam al night. It's nicht to verstehen. You look at the Rebbe's father's Teda and you see what's made in Rucham and it's neither more than an Amar Chassidus. It's so vast and it's so much. Every line is something else. And it's just pages. It's incredible. So somebody once asked Reb Leivik, how do they know all this? How do you know all this? So Reb Leivik said, "What made it again?" I was taught. Who taught him? Not a Chiyashi Lenin, the Rebbe Rashab. So the Yid who asked him the question said to Reb Leivik, if we add up all the time you spent on Lubavitch, it doesn't justify how much you say. You say so much more. In other words, the Rebbe Rashab sat every minute you were in Lubavitch and talked to you, Noni Kabbalah, you're speaking more than you heard. So the Rebbe's father said, "Close." Close. I was given rules of how to interpret Kabbalah. And there's a story that I want to tell you, in case it is, with the Rebbe Rashab himself. The Rebbe Rashab, in other words, the Rebbe Rashab was Reb Levi's Rebbe in Kabbalah. So it says in the Teda Shalom, the Rebbe Rashab Sichas, it says that the Rebbe Rashab said about himself, Ich habe Yad in Kabbalah. What was the expression he used? Ich habe Yad in Kabbalah. Yad, I have a hand in Kabbalah. And there's a story behind it. And the story behind it was that when the Rebbe Rashab was a little boy, he was in Tzemach Tzedek's room, Tzemach Tzedek's Yechidus. He couldn't have been more than 5. He was 5 and a half, Tzemach Tzedek was nostalgic. Tzemach Tzedek picked up the Rebbe Rashab, put him on his lap. And he took his little hand, Rebbe Rashab's hand, and he began to brush it through his beard. To separate the hairs. A beard that's entangled. He used the Tzemach Tzedek's fingers as a comb. And after a while, I don't know how long it took, the Tzemach Tzedek says, Yiddish, Zebersht, Dachzach Zebersht, Nadir Ayad in Kabbalah. So best. Did you separate the hairs? You haven't seen it. To brush out the beard means to separate it. You haven't seen it. Salzburg to the map. You have to separate the hairs. So he asked his grandson rhetorically, but the kid was 4 years old. He was talking to his neshama more than to his goof. He says, "No, did you disentangle or did you unentangle all the hairs of my beard?" I think so. Nadir Ayad, I'm giving you a Yad in Kabbalah. And 50 years later, the Rebbe Rashab, 40 years later, the Rebbe Rashab used to say, it's in the Teda Shalom, Ich habe Yad in Kabbalah. Because this is what the Rebbe's father lived. And he made him Rov in a big city. It was a very honorable thing. If you read the Rebbe's grandfather's description, Ravash, Rebbe Shneim says, me, the Rebbe didn't find a job for my boys, he found jobs. Believe me, the biggest favor he did for the Rebbe's grandfather when they didn't find him a job. Because that Rabbonis in a city like Yerusalem, to take a job in 1909 was, you would not have a day of peace. Was it impossible to have? Was it impossible to have? First of all, the politics. The community was torn up into 2 pieces, into 20 pieces. You had Frum and you had Frei. You had 5 or 6 different factions of Frei. You had anarchists, and Zionists, and Yiddishists, and communists, and socialists, whatever else. And then Frume. You had the modern Frume, you had the Haredi Frume, you had the Chassidim, you had the Misnagdim, Azaz and Chos, you know, and you had to walk into the raindrops. To become a Rav then was an almost impossible task. And by the way, when the Rebbe's father became a Rav initially, there was a second Rav, it was a Misnagdish Rav. He did not stay very long. When it became too hot in the kitchen, he left. So the Rebbe's father ended up with the Rabbanos. The Rebbe's father served as the Rebbe. He did this for 30 years. It was an impossible task. It was really impossible. And the Rebbe's parents were loved by the Kehillah unbelievably. People who hated deeply what the Rebbe stood for, what the Rebbe's father stood for, on a personal level, absolutely loved him. It was one of those really, really strange phenomena. They hated what he said, they loved him. And if you think about it, most Rabbanim in Russia didn't last till 1939. Most Rabbanim in Russia were in jail in 1927. How does the living last so long? I'm sure there's many answers, but the stories that they say is the guy would knock on the door, and Rebbe Tzimchana would open the door, and he would say to the Rebbe Tzimchana, "Heinz all the man geschlafen in der Ehe," and he would leave. Tonight, your husband shouldn't sleep at home. So he went to sleep someplace else, 2 o'clock in the morning. The KGB came, he wasn't home. It didn't happen once, it happened 20 times. People looked out for him. People who worked for the KGB would give them notice that today he shouldn't sleep at home, that kind of thing. And this is how the Rebbe Tzimchana describes it. And I think we know it from other sources. The Rebbe's father was a great mind, but he also had unbelievably good people skills. He literally able everybody in the city related to him, and he related to him. He was everybody's Rav. So you take a Yid, a Gon and a Kodesh, remember, a Emes a Gon and an Emes a Kodesh, and you throw him into such a Rishus HaRabbi. This is what was necessary. This was the time. And he served this Kehillah, he served the Kehillah for 30 years. And the Rebbe grew up in this house. The Rebbe grew up in this house. The Rebbe would often or occasionally make reference to his early years. So there's a famous story about it, which I'm not going to tell you. But the Nekudas HaSibur was that somebody blackmailed the Rebbe. Who blackmailed the Rebbe? The Rebbe Rashab, Perman's life. And he took his little hand, Rebbe Rashab's hand, and he began to brush it through his beard. To separate the hairs. A beard that dangled. He used the Tzemach Tzedek's fingers as a comb. And after a while, I don't know how long it took, the Tzemach Tzedek says, Yiddish, Zebesht, Dachzach Zebesht, Nadir Ayad and Kabbalah. Zebesht. Did you separate the hairs? You haven't seen it. To brush out the beard means to separate it. You haven't seen it. Salzpot in the map. You have to separate the hairs. So he asked his grandson rhetorically, but the kid was 4 years old. He was talking to his neshama more than to his goof. He says, "No, did you disentangle or did you unentangle all the hairs of my beard?" I think so. Nadir Ayad, I'm giving you a Yad and Kabbalah. And 50 years later, the Rebbe Rashab, 40 years later, the Rebbe Rashab used to say, it's in the Teresh Shalom, Iyechav Ayad and Kabbalah. This is what the Rebbe's father believed. And he made him Rav. In a big city. It was a very honorable thing. If you read the Rebbe's grandfather's description, Ravash, Rabbi Shneim says, me, the Rebbe, didn't find a job for my boys, he found jobs. Believe me, the biggest favor he did for the Rebbe's grandfather, they didn't find him a job. Because at Rabbonis, in a city like Yekatinoslavsk, to take a job in 1909 was, you would not have a day of peace. It was an impossible about. First of all, the politics. The community was torn up into 2 pieces, into 20 pieces. You had Frum and you had Frei. You had 5 or 6 different factions of Frei. You had anarchists, and Zionists, and Yiddishists, and communists, and socialists, whatever else. And then Frume. You had the modern Frume, you had the Haredi Frume, you had the Chassidim, you had the Misnagdim, Azaz and Chos, And you had to walk into the raindrops. To become a Rav then was an almost impossible task. And by the way, when the Rebbe's father became a Rav initially, there was a second Rav, it was a Spanish Rav. He did not stay very long. When it became too hot in the kitchen, he left. So the Rebbe's father ended up with the Rabbanos. The Rebbe's father served as the Rav. He did this for 30 years. It was an impossible task. It was really impossible. And the Rebbe's parents were loved by the Kehillah unbelievably. People who hated deeply what the Rebbe stood for, what the Rebbe's father stood for, on a personal level, absolutely loved him. It was one of those really, really strange phenomena. They hated what he said, they loved him. And if you think about it, most Rabbanim in Russia didn't last until 1939. Most Rabbanim in Russia were in jail in 1927. How did the lady last so long? I'm sure there's many answers, but the stories that they say is the guy would knock on the door, and Rebbe Tzimchana would open the door, and he would say to the Rebbe Tzimchana, "Heindel the man geschlossen in the day," and he would leave. Tonight, your husband shouldn't sleep at home. So he went to sleep someplace else, 2 o'clock in the morning. The KGB came, he wasn't home. It didn't happen once, it happened 20 times. People looked out for him. People who worked for the KGB would give them notice that today he shouldn't sleep at home, that kind of thing. And this is how the Rebbe Tzimchana describes it. And I think we know it from other sources. The Rebbe's father was a great mind, but he also had unbelievably good people skills. He literally able everybody in the city related to him. He related to him. He was everybody's Rav. So you take a Yid, a Gon and a Kodesh, remember, a Emes a Gon and an Emes a Kodesh, and you throw him into such a Rishus HaRabim. This is what was necessary. This was the time. And he served this Kehillah, he served the Kehillah for 30 years. And the Rebbe grew up in this house. The Rebbe grew up in this house. The Rebbe would often or occasionally make reference to his early years. So there's a famous story about it, which I'm not going to tell you. But the Nekudas HaSifa was that somebody blackmailed the Rebbe. Who blackmailed the Rebbe? Someone blackmailed the Rebbe, he threatened the Rebbe. Our Rebbe. There's a tape, Tafshil Lamadeh, you try to listen to the tape. So the Rebbe says, I was born in Soviet Russia. I was the oldest son of the Rav. So very often, they would call us in for questioning, and I had to go and answer questions. And the Rebbe said, and if I wasn't afraid of them, I'm going to be afraid of him. It's what the Rebbe said publicly. I wasn't afraid of the KGB and the sexy and the 20. The Rebbe grew up in a world of astonished. He grew up in a world of astonished. The Rebbe's entire life was surrounded by public service. And there's like a sort of a built-in contradiction here. On the one hand, the Rebbe was surrounded by astonished. On the other hand, the Rebbe and his brothers were totally oblivious to it. The Rebbe's parents came together themselves and they rented a very large apartment. The communists took a half an apartment away. But when they first came, they rented a gigantic apartment, and there was enough space for each child to have his own room. There were 3 boys in their own room. And they sat in that room 18 hours a day and learned Torah. The Rebbe Tzimchana used to tell people, I have to fight with them to eat. The Rebbe's mother said, I have to fight with them to eat. The Hasmada these 3 boys had. There's a Yid who wrote an essay about the Rebbe's brother. His name was Yeshaya Shah. He was a Machar in Israel. It went around him, and if I have it, it's not a secret. I have no connection to the secret file. He wrote an essay on the Rebbe's brother, Leib Gerard. He describes the Rebbe's brother. They knew each other in Russia, and then they knew each other in Israel. It's a painful document. It's very interesting, comprehensive. He was a member of the choir. They had the Rebbe's father was the runner of the whole city. The city had, I don't know how many, but the Knesset, 20 shuls, 100 shtivla. He was the Rav of all of that, but he davened in the largest shul. The largest shul was in Ashkelon, and he was a modern shul. A from shul, but it was a modern shul. And that's where the Rebbe's father davened. People say that the Rebbe used to do certain things, like meaning Ashkenaz, because in the shul that he grew up in, if you've ever watched how, when they do your Hallelujah, by us it's very short, right? Your Hallelujah. Hey, but then they say, if you would watch, the Rebbe would say the long Nusa. The Rebbe would say the whole time, because the shul where the Rebbe grew up, it was an Ashkenaz minyan, and they had a chazan and a choir. And Leibel was one of the kids in the choir. Then with this Ishaya showed the kid that had a great voice. He was apparently a soloist, and Rebbe's brother wanted to make his acquaintance. That's how they met. And he met him, and they talked. They became good friends. And we would spend a lot of time together. And he writes different things, which I'm not going to tell you now. You can find the document. If I found it, you can find it. Believe me, I don't have special connections. He said the oldest son they called the Rav Sawyer. There were 3 boys. The difference in age between the Rebbe and his next brother was a minimum of 3 years, possibly more. But the Rebbe was called a young Rebbe. The Rebbe was not Rebbe. The Rebbe, there were 3 of them, and the Rebbe was different. He describes this. There were 3 boys, and he was friends with the middle one. The older one was different. Even then, everybody knew the oldest son, the Rebbe was different. And the people have said that the Rebbe's entire chinuch, the Rebbe did not see the big world, when he came to America. He didn't grow up in a shtetl. He didn't grow up in a bunch. The Rebbe grew up in the Katinisland, in a large metropolis with tens of thousands of Jews, with winds, stormy winds in every imaginable direction, all blowing at the same time. And the Rebbe weathered these storms. Them was involved. Like I said before, the Rebbe and his brother were totally disinvolved. On the other hand, we know of 2 occasions, which the Rebbe would talk about from time to time, where the Rebbe literally closed his mother and he became a public servant. One of them is the one I told you before about the typhus epidemic. And the second one was, the Rebbe talking about the farbrengen ones, was when the immigrants arrived at the end of World War I. Near the end of World War I, tens of thousands of Jews arrived in the So the Rebbe said, they made different committees. One committee, how do you house tens of thousands of people who are coming with valises, mamish? So one had to find them housing, another committee had to find them clothing, another had to find them food, another committee had to find them work, another committee had to provide schooling for all of these children. And the Rebbe says, my mother was the chairman of the committee that oversaw all the committees. And he says, in my entire life, I never saw my mother operate like this. He's never seen his mother before or after. I got chush in son. He's never said a it. Anyway, the Rebbe and his brothers got involved. There are secular sources that tell stories of the immigrants who arrived in Katinisland and how the Schneerson boys helped them, physically helped them to find an apartment. And what they describe is that these immigrants arrived, and it wasn't only they gave them housing, and they gave them clothing, and they gave them food, and they provided them with jobs where it was possible, and they gave them schooling. They did it because they didn't feel like schnudders. They made the immigrants feel welcome. And they credited the Rebbe's parents and the Rebbe and his brothers. They were the vanguard of this effort. This was another occasion when the Rebbe literally closed his Gemara and became a Nasik. So the Rebbe's early years were saturated with Askonas. The Rebbe's father was the Rav. The Rebbe's father was the Rav, and his son led the Eidah, the Kilo, in a very incredible way. And of course, there's so many stories. The stories about a couple coming in the middle of the night to do a bris, or a couple in the night coming to make a chuppah, basically. An agent of the KGB shows up with his wife and says, don't tell anybody, but I want to get married to Datsun Kadin. Things like this. And this was what the Rebbe's parents did for all those years in Katinisland. And of course, the end of the story is the story with Matzah. End of the story is the story with Matzah. Okay, so